Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Jamie Myers and I work for the CLTS Knowledge Hub based at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on support mechanisms and rural sanitation programming. I'd like to start by giving a very brief overview of the Hub's work for those who may not be familiar with us. Our goal is to understand the on-the-ground realities of sanitation and hygiene programming and to learn about, share and promote good practices, ideas and innovations. We do this through running the CLTS website, www.community-led-total-sanitation.org, through workshops, by producing a monthly newsletter, and through publications such as Frontiers of CLTS, Innovations and Insights series, the latest edition of which we will be hearing about today. So we'll be hearing from two of the authors today. The first is Jeremy Kohlitz, a senior research consultant at the Institute of Sustainable Futures, University of Technology, Sydney. Jeremy specializes in interdisciplinary and applied research on WASH. We'll also be hearing from Juliet Willetts, also based at the Institute of Sustainable Futures. Juliet leads applied research to improve development policy and practice and to address social justice and sustainable development. To kick off the webinar, we'll have a presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A session. You should be able to see a chat box on the right of your screen. Please type in any questions you may have for our presenters there. You'll see there's a drop-down box. If you select to organizers and panelists, the organizers and panelists will be able to see the questions that you pose. You're able to type these in throughout the presentation and the Q&A session, and I'll be collecting them and posing them to Jeremy and Juliet when the Q&A session begins. So I wanted to say one final thing before I hand it over to Juliet and Jeremy, and that is that this publication is part 2 of a 2-part series. The first, titled Equity and Non-Discrimination in Sanitation Programs at Scale, was written by Sarah Howes, Sue Cavell and Suzanne Ferron, and it was developed from the learning and recommendations identified in an equity and non-discrimination scoping and diagnosis process they conducted for the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council's Global Sanitation Fund. Part 1 of this edition focused on how to support those most in need through community and local arrangements. And part 2, which is about to be presented, titled Support Mechanisms to Strengthen Equity and Non-Discrimination in Rural Sanitation, examines a wider range of support mechanisms designed to help disadvantaged groups gain access to and use continuously hygienic toilets, driving more equitable rural sanitation outcomes. Part 1 is available online, and I will share the link with participants in a follow-up email. Part 2 will be published next week, and I will also share a link to this in the next email. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jeremy and Juliet. And just a reminder that please, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just include them in the chat box. Thank you very much. Are you ready, Jeremy?
Yes, we're all ready, Jamie.
Great.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you for everyone attending today. Julia and I will be taking turns presenting the slides here, and I'll get us kicked off. Before we actually start with the slides, we're going to try a quick poll here. We just want to ask really quickly to everyone in attendance, simply, where do you work or where do you study if you're a student? I'm going to attempt to launch a poll, and it should appear on your screen with a few options. and hopefully one of those options matches your working or study situation well. So we're going to let this run for just a small moment. Make a selection if you can, and then shortly we'll share the responses so we can see what the profile of the audience is. We're getting live results right now, and it's expected it's predominantly NGO, indicating some development practitioners, but few people from research institutions, universities, and consultancies and development agencies as well. No one's replied government yet, so it looks like we're mostly a group of researchers and practitioners. Okay.
How do you show it?
Yeah, I think we're going to close it. It looks like the numbers have settled. And share. So as you can see, 43%, most of these and NGOs. A pretty good spread across different, I guess, types of practitioners and researchers, but unfortunately, no government authorities in attendance today. Great, thanks everyone. This should be able to see the screen again. So very quickly, the agenda for our presentation today. I'm briefly going to introduce why even use support mechanisms in the first place. Points 2 and 3, we're going to alternate back and forth a little bit. Initially, I'm going to introduce some of Sarah House's and colleagues' work on clusters of disadvantage and who might be disadvantaged. We'll then go into characterizing support mechanisms and giving you some examples of what those look like. And then we're going to loop back to methods for identifying disadvantaged or potentially disadvantaged groups. From there, we have 3 case studies that we're going to share that will hopefully kind of ground what we're talking about today with some real practical examples. From there, we'll move on to point 4 about what do successful support mechanisms look like and how can we monitor those in practice. And then we'll conclude with some takeaway messages for practice. So to begin very briefly about why support mechanisms are needed. Well, we've all heard by now that there's substantial inequalities in access to rural sanitation. The JMP has just recently released a special report on inequalities. And from an international and national perspective, there's quite apparent inequalities across wealth quintiles and regions. But we also know that there's inequalities at more localized levels within communities and even within households. Unfortunately, this is not nearly well as documented, and there's not a lot of rigorous evidence on it, although we do know these inequalities exist from experiential knowledge and anecdotal evidence. And this was covered in detail in the last issue on the last CLTS Frontiers issue on equality and non-discrimination. And then also in that last issue, Sarah House and her colleagues made a useful diagram about who might need support. When we think of people that require targeted support mechanisms to help them access sanitation, people often go to this first box on poverty or lack of physical or economic related assets. But we know that there's other ways that people experience disadvantage. And not only do they experience one of these, but they experience the intersection of all these things or any combination of these things. And this is important to consider because when you design the support mechanism, it needs to fit the needs of the particular group and the particular challenges that they're facing. So I'm going to hand over to Juliet, but before we move on to Juliet's slide, we actually have another poll that we're going to kick off. The first one went quite well, so we are going to launch another one here. And the question for this one, well, I'll let Juliet introduce the question for this poll.
Okay, so thank you, Jeremy and Jamie, and hello everyone. So the poll is just to ask about what types of support mechanisms you might have used. So this webinar software only allowed us 5 possible answers, no more. So this list is not complete, but we thought it would be interesting to see what kind of mechanisms you have been involved in using in trying to reach all in the different programs that you're involved in. And so if you could click on, you can click on more than one as needs. There's still some people voting. Oh, it's changing second by second. We get the live view. Unfortunately, we can't show you the live view. We have to wait till it settles and then we will show you the results. Still changing, still changing. Okay, at the moment in the lead is the first one, the inclusive sanitation technologies, but I don't want to affect your voting, so maybe I shouldn't tell you which is in the lead. It's still changing. Okay, I think it's just about settled. I'm going to close it and share it. Okay, so this is how you've responded against those 5 types. So we can see that a focus on inclusive sanitation technologies for different types of needs is the most used mechanism at this point by this audience. Localizing local leader support, second, and then different forms of community-based finance, third, and then different forms of inclusive business models, and lastly, engaging with rights-based groups. Great, so we'll move back to the presentation and continue on. So this slide is about how we've characterized support mechanisms. And I guess what we were trying to do is go beyond the idea of whether a support mechanism is about a subsidy or not a subsidy, which has been a long-standing debate in the sector, and particularly with respect to CLTS. So support mechanisms for us cover a wide range of ways of supporting potentially disadvantaged groups and can include financial, in-kind or non-material. And what we've found through the studies we've done is that they work best in combinations. So the 3 main actors, which you can see mentioned in the middle of this slide, community, business and government, who all can be actors in how support mechanisms are operationalized. And an important factor in long-term success is going to be about the institutionalization of different support mechanisms, and particularly in local government programs, strategies and budgets. How do I make that then to animate? It's supposed to come up, the next one. Okay. All right, so sorry about that, a little bit of technology. So a really common support mechanism used in CLTS in particular is about mobilizing intra-community support through motivating local leaders to look at how to pool resources, how to pool labor, how to find out what the barriers are for different community members. So that's a fairly well-known support mechanism. As we had in the poll, engaging with rights holder groups is another important support mechanism and can really help in finding respectful and effective ways for engaging and giving voice to marginalised groups. Then there's a range of different sorts of financial mechanisms where the source might come from within the community, say with something like savings groups or revolving loans, or might be, for instance, through different sorts of business models who may offer rebates, discount vouchers, different sorts of support. But equally, they might offer support through affordable models and products. So not just through financial mechanisms, but through their selection of the products that they provide. And inclusive business models can also include ways in which upfront cash or in-kind transfers are provided to community members. A further range of support mechanisms includes ways of collecting information and better understand context-specific needs of different groups. So formative research with potentially disadvantaged groups is a really important initial strategy to understand and develop support mechanisms. And on that, develop different forms of either advocacy or action and planning that responds to those. And finally, the last one, which won the poll, is the development of technologies that meet specific needs, since, as Jeremy mentioned, support isn't just about dealing with poverty as an issue, but also other types of disadvantage. So as I mentioned, institutionalization of support is really critical if we're thinking about the long term and we're thinking about reaching everyone, everywhere at scale. Then we really need to think about how local governments can integrate a pro-poor approach into their strategies. And so this has been done, an example is SMB's work in multiple countries. So in Nepal, where they've integrated pro-poor approaches into district sanitation strategies, and then that then involves different sorts of citizen forums, the role of WASH committees and budgets, which can help ensure that in the long term, all people are being reached, not just through single programs. And then returning back to the issue of how do we even know who's potentially disadvantaged and what are the ways of finding that out? There are a whole range of different methods which you see in front of you. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I think the important thing to say is that there's a whole spectrum from starting from using existing data and information to doing very specific studies, which could either be done by external actors or by community or local government themselves. But some key things to bear in mind in identifying potentially disadvantaged groups is firstly to think about assumptions that sit behind the way we're categorizing and thinking about different groups, to acknowledge and balance the trade-offs between having a very simple method to identify with comprehensive, and the need for transparency in the way that our groups are identified. And lastly, that identifying potentially disadvantaged groups shouldn't just be done once, for instance, at the beginning of a program. It's very possible that things will play out in different ways, and we know well that slippage and moving back to open defecation commonly happens for disadvantaged groups, so it shouldn't be something that's just done once. So I'm now going to hand back to Jeremy to speak through the few case studies.
Thank you, Juliet. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to cover 3 case studies here. These are 3 case studies that we looked at while we were writing this issues of the CLTS Frontiers. I understand that we may have some of the program implementers in the audience right now, so I hope I do justice to describing their programs. And I will have to go through quickly in each one's in the interest of time. So first, I'd like to start off with the Community Hygiene Output-Based Aid Program in Vietnam. This was designed by East Meets West, and this particular case was implemented in Vietnam. So East Meets West had this program that was based on an output-based approach in which CLTS-like triggering activities were used to create demand. However, unlike CLTS, poor families were offered rebates once they finished constructing a latrine. Also, once their communities or their communes reached certain thresholds of ODF status, conditional cash transfers were given to the communes. And there were also financial incentives to implementing partners and local governments in order to sort of incentivize or motivate them to support latrine construction in their. Sorry about that. We lost the slide.
Okay, it's back.
It's back, sorry. But they did not just use financial support mechanisms. There were processes to train local masons to construct the latrines. And they also engaged local government authorities, including people's communes committees and village women's unions, and promoting latrine use and in the administrative support and in the M&E. And this was an important process for institutionalizing the implementation of the mechanisms. The poor families were identified through a range of methods, including existing data within the government of Vietnam, but also EMW did some of their own assessments ahead of time. So for each one of these case studies, we pulled out one salient lesson. There was quite a few for all of them, but in the interest of time, we're just sharing one. And one that East meets West reflected on, that sort of speaks to something that we just spoke on in the last slide, is that there's a trade-off between ensuring a high rate of reporting accuracy and verification and cost. So East meets West and their partners did quite a bit of work in training local implementers and getting government involved in monitoring and evaluation. And that's, it was great work to support verification and to create a robust M&E system, but as they note, it does require a substantial amount of time and resources to invest in. Case study 2 is the phased approach to total sanitation. This has been applied in a few different areas. In this particular case was during the recovery from Typhoon Haiyan that struck Philippines a few years back. Typically in a phased approach to total sanitation program, CLTS is used initially to raise demand and get communities to construct latrines. And then once they reach 100% ODF status, then financial incentives are provided so that households can take their latrines to the next level of sanitation service, that is to climb the sanitation ladder. Because this program was implemented in a post-emergency context, some of the implementing partners did it a little bit differently. UNICEF was the coordinator, and there was several different implementing partners, and some of them did give the incentives to families ahead of time in order to help them in an emergency situation. They also supported local business to create local supply chains and trained local masons to construct robust latrines. And they put quite a bit of time into working with local government authorities, including to get them to develop disaster wash plans and sanitation budgets within local government units. And that was one of the salient lessons that they pulled out from their program, that even in a post-emergency scenario, it's worthwhile to advocate to local leaders and to work with local government to institutionalize support mechanisms. So we often think about how institutionalizing things in local government is this slow and painful process, but even in this post-emergency context, the reflection was that it was still worthwhile. Finally, case study 3 is on the Sustainable Sanitation and Hygiene for All program, which has been conducted in many countries, but we focused on Zambia and Tanzania. And the SSH4A program focuses on district-wide sanitation outcomes and long-term engagement in communities. And they use quite a lot of mechanisms, more than I could fit on a slide here, but I just pulled out some of the interesting ones that they did, which included supporting community champions to advise households on how to construct latrines that meet government standards once CLTS triggering activities were implemented. Sanitation marketing groups that pooled resources at the village level to lower the bulk costs, which made latrine materials more affordable for poorer groups. Behavior change messages that were customized to specific audiences through formative research. And in Tanzania, local business entrepreneurs offered low-cost, durable latrines, and also booklets were distributed to households in order to inform them on how to design inclusive sanitation technologies. And a key lesson that was pulled out from this one was that the formative research and focus studies in collaboration with local government was key for really identifying who those vulnerable groups were and how their needs could be met, and then for subsequently for disaggregating data to monitor progress. So a big question that people often have when we talk about support mechanisms is when to apply them. And this is particularly an issue for CLTS, where people are concerned about the opportunity or the potential for mechanisms to undermine demand. In the case of non-financial or non-hardware mechanisms, or what you might call software mechanisms, these are really beneficial at any time, we think. However, because a lot of them involve working with the private sector and working with the local government, these processes can take time. So we think that it's best to start these non-financial mechanisms early on, even before entering a community, so that they're already set up and in place by the time you're encouraging communities to start building latrines. However, in the case of financial and hardware subsidies, it's a bit more tricky, and it probably depends on the context. This table has a list of some of the advantages and disadvantages. Mostly the advantage for having subsidies near the beginning is it helps you to immediately start moving people from open defecation to having latrines. And it can also reduce costs associated with bulk transport. But of course, the major disadvantage is that it can potentially undermine sort of the principles of CLTS around demand for sanitation and community-driven solutions. Waiting to provide a financial subsidy after a certain ODF threshold has been met incentivizes demand, and it helps to continue to engage with communities after ODF has already been achieved. For example, in the phased approach, where you kind of take them up to higher rungs on the sanitation ladder. But disadvantages, and some of these were touched on in more detail in the previous issue on equality and non-discrimination, is that some households genuinely just cannot get to that ODF status, and this can put a lot of pressure on them. And from a human rights perspective, you could argue that we're not doing everything that we can to immediately get people from no service to some basic better level of service. So unfortunately, we don't have a simple correct answer for you about when to apply it. It's going to depend on a lot of different conditions. Moving on to the next slides, I'll let Juliet facilitate our third poll.
Okay, so just bear with me while I find the poll. Which one? Okay. So over to you, audience, to hear about monitoring. So this next part of the presentation is about monitoring, but before launching in, it would be great to hear from you. Which of these dimensions are things that you might monitor in your programs, or programs that you know of or are engaged on? So is it just about access, or is it also about these other dimensions? So great to see everyone voting, and then we know that people haven't gone to sleep, or they haven't started looking at the internet or some other screen on their computer whilst being logged into the webinar. So there's lots of responses coming in. So I'll leave it just a little bit longer. Still changing. This time I'm not giving anything away. I think you can guess for yourself which one might be ahead, but I won't say. All right, it seems to have settled. Oh no, it's still changing. Still changing. Okay. No, it's still, every time I decide I'm going to close it, then you keep voting. I wonder if people are just changing their vote. All right, long enough. I'm going to close it off. So everyone has voted, and I'm sharing the results. So there you go. I think you probably guessed that the most monitored thing is access to a latrine. It's a new spelling of latrine. But we also have use being monitored to a great extent, so that's great to see. We have monitoring relating to institutionalization in government, that's great. Even costs, and much less focus on whether or not we're hindering progress in other areas. So we'll jump back to the presentation. So thank you for that. I think that's, yeah, I'm not surprised. I guess I'm a little surprised that so many people are monitoring institutionalization, and that's great to hear. So to go through these one by one, there are various, I guess, challenges and imperatives for monitoring. And the first thing to say, actually, even before jumping into these 5, is that in developing this issue of frontiers of CLTS, one of the initial steps that the Hub took was to compile a whole set of more than 50 CLTS programs and do a review of those to look at what kinds of support mechanisms were being used and what the outcomes were. And what that showed was that there was a whole breadth of different mechanisms being tried, but there was very, very little evidence about use of them at scale. And there was also very little disaggregated data that would help you understand the effectiveness of the different mechanisms that had been employed. And so hence the importance of this whole area of monitoring, and this first item that if we are going to try various support mechanisms, we really, really must try and understand whether they're working or not, because we actually also may be making things worse for certain groups unless we try to find out. So access is something to look at, and it's also something not to look at just once because of the issue of slippage, that we need to understand who is slipping back, why are they slipping back, and what needs to be done about it. And clearly disaggregated data is something that's expensive to collect, and it also needs to be done carefully, given that there's potential to increase stigma in the case of particular groups, and it's also quite challenging in terms of classifying people into groups. So it's something that needs to be done carefully, but it is something that we all need to give focus. So the second one about use, there are, again, challenges in monitoring use, but I guess one of the reasons why it's essential is getting to that intra-household level and getting beyond just assuming that just because there's a toilet that all household members are using it. And so methods such as self-reporting, surveys, diaries, and physical checking of facilities are some of the common methods to monitor use. The third one, monitoring to actually check whether mechanisms are institutionalized. So this is particularly in local government, and as mentioned earlier, is about understanding the extent to which support mechanisms are integrated into district or local level plans, budgets, strategies. But it could also be about how institutionalized processes are in the private sector. So for instance, what are the attitudes and the kind of focus of private sector who are involved in supplying or installing latrines? What are they is part of their business plan to try and reach all? Are they trying to cross-subsidize? That's also a form of institutionalization. And then moving to the fourth one. So this is the fourth one. This is the one that didn't do so well on the polling vote. But I guess if we think about what Jeremy mentioned earlier about this question of timing and when to introduce support, it's a really critical one for us to find out about. Any type of support mechanism is going to have some intended consequences, but also quite likely some unintended ones. And if we don't try and follow up on what those are, then we could be undermining approaches in other areas. So two, I guess, fairly easy steps to take to try and understand whether we're hindering progress elsewhere is engaging with local authorities, but also engaging with suppliers or other key informants to understand changes in willingness to pay, changes in demand. And then lastly, the cost of support mechanisms. So some of you mentioned that you're looking at this. I think as a sector, if we're going to, again, really get to scale and really reach everyone, then the issue of scaling up is critical. And I think in coming up with what the costs are, we need to not just think, for instance, about how much a subsidy is and multiply that by the number of subsidies provided, but it's actually understanding when we look at this, the breadth of different support mechanisms that we're trying to put forward through this issue. There are many that involve simply human resources. They involve facilitation. They involve engagement processes. And those cost money to orchestrate, and those costs need to be part of any monitoring of costs of support mechanisms. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Jeremy for the last couple slides.
Thank you, Juliet. So one thing that we discovered while we were writing this issue is that despite that there's wide recognition about the importance of this issue and how you can almost talk to anyone and they can relay a personal story about inequalities that they've observed in the field, there's quite little actually documented in terms of rigorous evidence and data. We suspect that some of it's out there, but maybe not all of it's been shared publicly, or it's not actually necessarily been written up in easy to digest reports. So this is a big gap that needs filling. If we want to accelerate the progress that potentially disadvantaged groups need to achieve universal sanitation by 2030, then we need better mechanisms for documenting what works well and sharing those with the wider sector. So this is just a list of a few things that would be helpful to address in the coming years by both practitioners and researchers. This includes disaggregated data across different social groups on their progress towards achieving sustained use of sanitation facilities, common evaluation indicators for measuring equitable progress against SDG 6.2. A lot of evaluation indicators are designed for a specific project or program, but we need something common that we can all report against. Evidence of when it's appropriate to introduce support mechanisms, especially in the case of conventional CLTS. It might not be the case that conventional CLTS always needs an additional support mechanism to get everyone to safe sanitation, but it should be considered if it's appropriate. Moreover, there should be more evidence about which combinations of support mechanisms work for whom and what contexts. And of course, going back to that slide about appropriate timing, documenting examples, case studies, knowledge, and data about what's effective in terms of timing. And then, of course, the big implication of all of this is that it requires concerted effort or concerted attention towards budgeting and planning for monitoring, research, and knowledge sharing that really needs to be included in the initial design of a program or a service. So we're going to end the presentation here with one last slide on just some of our key takeaway messages. There's a lot to cover, and it's all will be included in writing in the next CLTS Frontiers issue when it gets published. But a few that I just wanted to lift up in this presentation is that programs and service deliveries should aim to create specific targets in terms of achieving open defecation status area-wide, and they need to work out how much progress needs to be made amongst disadvantaged groups so that they can achieve open defecation free status and beyond at the same time as their counterparts who are less disadvantaged. And of course, this requires a budget and plan for disaggregated monitoring. It's crucial to involve local government, principally as the duty bearer, that they should be institutionalizing support mechanisms and being involved in their design, implementation, and monitoring. And this can also include other local actors like local CSOs or the private sector as well. When we design support mechanisms, if we want to reach people at scale, the mechanisms, the cost of the mechanisms and the complexity of them need to be managed. One, so that they can be feasibly taken to scale, but two, so that they're not so convoluted that they can't be institutionalized in government processes. Fourth is to form partnerships between implementers and researchers, or to use in-house research to create the evidence that we were talking about. As I mentioned, there's a lack of real rigorous evidence about support mechanisms, despite the relative importance of the issue. And then finally, once that evidence has been generated, to document it and share it with the rest of the world, including on the CLTS Knowledge Hub, which is a convenient platform for sharing successes and challenges associated with the support mechanisms. So thanks everyone for joining us. That concludes our presentation. A bit of contact details for Juliet and I if you wanted to get in touch. And maybe we'll hand it over to Jamie now to facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Juliet and Jeremy. It was a very informative presentation. Just before we start, I just wanted to apologize to people who are unable to see the bottom of the slides. There appears to be something wrong with the software. We will, however, send out the slides to you, so you will be able to cross-reference anything you may have missed. I think it was just the last few sentences, which were the last line, which was being cut off. So we have had a number of questions in already, but there's still time to be asking questions, so please do add them. Please do add to the questions if you have any burning issues you'd like to hear from Jeremy and Juliet about. There was the first question was about looking at, well, I'll start with the general one. One of the questions was, why not give full subsidy? Why are we having this conversation?
So I'll jump in on that. Why not give full subsidy? I think that would take us back, I don't know, 30 years or longer to approaches that we used in the past. I think we established there's a strong evidence base that that's not going to lead to sanitation for all, and that those households who can provide their own latrines, that they should be providing. And equally that for ownership and a contribution, those who, even though potentially disadvantaged, may well be able to contribute. Maybe it's not money, maybe it's labour, but involvement in the whole process of having a latrine, wanting a latrine and having a latrine and then using a latrine. So I think full subsidy is not going to be feasible for the sector. We need to be much more careful about how we use scarce resources to make sure we're reaching all.
Great, thanks for that. Another question is regarding local governments, and in countries where there is potentially low capacity or overstretched staff, how would you go about supporting those processes if you judge that the capacity there is unable to lead the process?
Yeah, that's a good question, I think, and that's the reality of the situation in a lot of places with local government. In some places, it may simply just not be feasible for local government to lead anything or to take on too much responsibility. And I think the point is to, where possible, improve the capacity of the government to include them where available, such that they might not be initially leading it, but every intervention or every program is an opportunity to build on the capacity of the government and to advocate to central government to allocate more resources. So it's not something that you can realistically implement overnight in a single program to put local government completely in the driver's seat, but perhaps something that can be incrementally built up over time.
Did you come across any examples in areas, any good examples which could be shared in areas with low capacity or overstretched staff?
I think most of the ones we read are of that nature, in that you know, in many cases it's different development partners working in partnership with government and making a balance between their role and that of local government based on capacity. So I think, I mean, the original study that we undertook with SNV that led into some of what's captured in this issue of frontiers. I mean, SNV's engagement in somewhere like Bhutan, where there's higher capacity in government, has meant that local governments are able to take a stronger role, and also in many places in Nepal, and then in other places in some of the African countries where there's lower capacity, there's a strengthened role for a development partner. But I think I think we do need to be thinking about the long term. We do need to be thinking about how to work ourselves all out of a job. And so anything that we can be doing at both local and national level to be gradually shifting responsibility to the natural duty bearers needs to be a central part of, I think, development actors' strategies.
Mm. And did you come across many programs where government have picked up support mechanisms and expanded them beyond CSO programs and taken them to scale?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't come across one, not saying that it hasn't happened, but we didn't come across one that I would say that really took it to scale or on their own pushed it out to a greater degree. For example, the phased approach to total sanitation program that we just mentioned in this presentation was successful in getting local government units to create sanitation budgets that they could continue to roll out in the future. But in terms of local government or government at any level sort of expanding something beyond the program, we did not encounter, and it would be really interesting if any of the audience members have seen something like that and would be able and willing to share information on it.
Other than in India, I suppose, which is a slightly different beast.
It's a different controversy, yes.
Okay. We had another question about intra-community support and whether there was any systematic studies of better off community members helping those most in need.
Yeah, I wouldn't say large-scale studies. Again, going back to the SNV study, there was definitely examples of that. And so, for instance, in Nepal, the WASH committees were looking at the different barriers in the terai and found that it wasn't just affordability, but it was also landlessness that was leading to some community members not being able to build a toilet. And they mobilized support both to have access to land of temples or of other community members. And they also mobilized ways to recognize and praise community members who were taking on roles to, for instance, provide finance or land, etc., and recognize that. So those are examples of where, local leaders took develop different types of intra-community support mechanisms.
Okay, great. We've had another comment and question. It's about why when we talk about support mechanisms in the WASH sector, we don't talk more about supporting those to participate with an increased voice in changing power relations. And are there ways to convince local leaders and program implementers on understanding the need for support mechanisms beyond toilet construction? So looking at inclusive participation with those who are potentially disadvantaged or may not be included in discussions.
Yeah. So I would say of the support mechanisms we mentioned, it would be about working with the different sorts of rights holder groups. So for instance, disabled people's organisations or women's rights organisations. I think working with them to identify and give voice to those groups is definitely one support mechanism that we would say is a really critical and important one. Because we're starting from a starting point of potential marginalisation, and we can't assume that it's going to be easy to find out the needs and the voice of those who are being excluded. So I think both advocacy done by those groups, partnering with those groups is all part of how to develop effective support mechanisms.
And I think from your presentation, you're not advocating that one support mechanism is going to change the world, it's going to need a balance of a number of different ones, which work both in terms of increasing participation and potential external support mechanisms.
Yeah, that's right. We wanted to make the point that we don't advocate for implementing any one of the support mechanisms in isolation, but rather that we want to promote combinations of those support mechanisms, and often pairing what you might call hardware and software mechanisms, although those two tend to blend together more than we might think. And I think that the person who asked the question that you brought up, Jamie, was perhaps alluding to that we don't pay enough attention to that issue of creating space for people to make their voices heard and to influence decision-making processes. One thing we found while researching for this issue was the predominant focus is on financial mechanisms and providing various forms of rebates and vouchers and things like that. And those may not get at the crux of why people are experiencing disadvantage in the first place. They may be treating the symptom rather than the cause, that is. So I agree that it's something that needs more attention. I think it's something that everyone agrees with. But I think perhaps it's challenging in practice, and that could be one issue or one reason why it doesn't get as much attention as it does. So yeah, more engagement, I guess, as Juliet mentioned, with local advocacy groups who are skilled in discussing sensitive issues with communities and addressing those sensitive issues that involve power dynamics and social relationships, I think will help to address some of these more structural and political drivers of inequality.
Great, thanks for that. There's another one, is if you were able to give some advice on if it's better to target specific households within the community with a support mechanism or target the whole community with a support mechanism, and what evidence is available to make that choice.
Yeah, I guess my starting point would have been that we're working at community level. I mean, I think we're advocating for approaches that reach open defecation free status area wide. We're trying to reach everyone. We need to look at across the community and do the work that helps us identify those with barriers to accessing sanitation and work from those to address those barriers. So for me, yeah, it's not about household by household, it's understanding the needs across a community.
But I suppose the question is if you know that if the incentive should go to the community as a whole, sorry, not the incentive, the support mechanism should go to the community as a whole, or to, let's say, 4 or 5 households, lagging households.
We don't have, say, like a systematic review of evidence or something that I guess conclusively states one way or the other. What comes to mind for me is the first case study that we brought up on community hygiene output-based aid in Vietnam, where they offered rebates to individual households that built latrines, and also offered conditional cash transfers to entire communes that reached certain levels of ODF. And they did some randomized controlled trials to compare the outcomes across those two, and found that the rebates being offered to individual households were more effective at getting the latrines constructed than the conditional cash transfers to the whole commune. So in that specific case study, targeting the individual households was more effective. But I wouldn't say that's true though in every situation.
And there's still the need to always be thinking about the community-wide.
And there's always the need to think about area-wide outcomes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks for that. There's another question about the three case studies which were presented. So with the example from Vietnam, Choba and Fats in the Philippines, there was a pro-poor focus including financial support. And in the SSH4A, there was community-wide interventions with no financial support per se. Was there any difference in the outcomes for vulnerable people? And did the targeting make a difference to the level of sanitation access for the most vulnerable? Or is that data collected?
Yeah, data was collected across the different programs, but through different modes and looking at different things. I don't think that they could be compared directly across all three to really make a reasonable conclusion about what sorts of mechanisms were more successful than others. I think each of the programs had positive outcomes and then other outcomes that did not meet expectations. But yeah, I find it difficult to make a comparison across the case studies.
And I think a key point to add is to come back to our point about combinations of mechanisms, that the Vietnam and the Philippines examples were not financial mechanisms in the absence of others. They were in combination with many others, and that the sanitation water, sustainable sanitation for all also includes mobilisation within communities, etc. So it's not that finance is missing completely from the picture. So I think we need to be really careful both how we categorise and how we think about support, and that we shouldn't get stuck thinking down lines of single mechanisms and their effectiveness. I think we need to really be looking at combinations and their effectiveness.
Great. I have an answer to one of the earlier questions from Louise Moore, who works for UNICEF in the Philippines.
Right.
Who says that in the Philippines it's in regarding to low capacity of local government. But so in the Philippines there is very low capacity for sanitation with limited staff and low levels of training. But by creating wash councils at different levels, UNICEF could make sanitation the responsibility of more than just one person, but a unit. This meant that better resource departments could be drawn on. For example, in one province, the Wash Council included ODF targets into their expected results of the nurse deployment program. So nurses deployed to rural health units became allies and additional resource people for CLTS triggering and monitoring, which is a useful example. And linked to another question which I had earlier, which I'd seen earlier, which is kind of who did you find examples or could you give any recommendations of, other than what particular government departments would you advise working with on this type of thing? Who are your allies at the local level when rolling out support mechanisms? Who should be who should you be having these conversations with?
Yeah, that's the eternal question for sanitation, isn't it? So obviously it's often health agencies of some type that are often in a lead role to do with rural sanitation. And I think particularly if we think about the support mechanisms that also involve inclusive business options, then those government departments that also deal with private sector development and support for enterprises, etc., are another agency that could be involved. Often agencies involved in municipal planning are the ones that have more say around budgets. So I think it's good to go beyond health probably as a response, that if we're thinking about this more broadly, and yeah, there could be another agency that looks after social safety nets and their administration, and that can be one way of through the different forms of direct transfer. So I think we should be thinking beyond one government department if we're thinking about support mechanisms.
Great. And there's a question regarding community-wide rebates for success. or rewards which are given to the community. Have there been any studies which look at that they can kind of disrupt intra-community support mechanisms, or what mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that then they don't get captured by the powerful within that community? Is there a way to ensure they are actually community-wide and community-used?
Yeah.
And that's tricky, and I think that's something a lot of people are confronted with is elite capture and people taking advantage of mechanisms that shouldn't be eligible for them, and perhaps at the expense of other people that need them. I mean, I guess the most obvious response is this robust verification systems and robust monitoring and evaluation systems that collects a robust data at the beginning of the intervention to identify who's actually eligible for the mechanisms, and then working with trusted partners to make sure that say rebates, for example, are only distributed to those that need them. But in terms of a study done about the potential for community-wide rebates to disrupt community processes, I don't recall. I feel like that's something that even the audience might know more than us just from their practice in the field.
Yeah, maybe just an addition around the community-wide rebates and how they could be designed better. I think that's ultimately about having a good participatory process around deciding what that rebate is and who it benefits. And if there's multiple voices in the process of deciding that, then hopefully we avoid elite capture around those rebates. So I think it just comes back to good community development and addressing power relations, same as we would in designing any other type of mechanism.
Great, thank you. There is another question about referring to the case studies. Firstly, a little bit more information about when they were implemented and how long they've been implemented for, and the numbers of households or communities who have been.
That information will be available in the issue when it comes out, but I can just quickly read off some. The CHOVA in Vietnam was running from 2012 to 2016, although I think it's being replicated in other countries. This one, an outcome of it was that 113,500 latrines were built by the target population, which was the poorest 40% of households. It initially aimed to reach poor families across 246 communes in 8 provinces. For FATS in the Philippines, aimed to reach 900,000 beneficiaries across 40 municipalities in 6 provinces. And the proportion of households in the program areas that used an unshared improved sanitation facility rose from 64% at baseline to 76% was one of the outcomes. And then for case study number 3, I'm sorry, about the date of implementation for FATS, that was 2014 to 2016. And then for sustainable sanitation and hygiene for all, which was run 2014 to 2017 in Zambia and Tanzania, although it's run in other countries at different time frames. This one, it targeted 4 districts in the northern province of Zambia and 5 districts in the lake and northern zones of Tanzania. And there was actually SNV did quite a bit of monitoring, including disaggregated monitoring. I might not read off all of the individual figures. They're here. They're in the issue, but they did document open defecation falling across the poorest quintile and female-headed households, and the proportion of people using functional clean toilets increasing across all households, including female-led households and the poorest quintile, and people with disabilities, or households with people with disabilities.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, just to reiterate, the publication will be available for free online next week. So all these figures are included in there. There's another question about how would you advise governments who are very resistant to include any kind of external support mechanism and any kind of hardware, and I suppose the same thing could be said for any government which is not investing so much in software. How do we kind of sell the need for these both hardware and software to reach those most in need in some parts of the world?
Yep, so I think that's about involving government officials in finding out what the situation is for different disadvantaged groups. So through some kind of formative research, or even not necessarily as complex as formative research, but to engage them in directly to be able to meet some of these disadvantaged community members, such that they gain an actual real experience of the barriers faced and of a raised awareness of what the needs are. I think that's the most powerful way to change kind of perceptions and assumptions about what is or isn't needed, whether that be about hardware or software.
Were any of the programs, was there any kind of resistance from governments in any of the documents you reviewed?
It's not something people have written about that we've read, no.
Yeah, okay. But there is kind of...
It doesn't mean that there isn't, it just means people haven't written about that. Yeah. aspect. Yeah.
But mainly you're saying like advocacy efforts involve kind of getting them to participate in understanding the needs of the communities they serve and the vulnerable in the communities they serve.
That's correct.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left before we have to shut it down. I have a couple more questions. I am trying to summarize. There's quite a few questions coming in at once, so I'm trying to summarize them as we go. So I do apologize if I do miss some. And if you do have any more questions, please do email us and we'll try to get some answers for you. But there was a question quite early on which I wanted to come back to, which was about operating in fragile areas and conflict zones, or areas where it's difficult to get staff and materials there. If there were any examples or any advice for those areas.
So that's not something that we've seen specific things written about. I think obviously it's dealing with extremely vulnerable populations, probably not just the disadvantaged groups, but more generally. So I think, again, it kind of normal development practice principles hold in working in such places, but we haven't read specific studies that address those contexts in thinking about support mechanisms.
And thanks for that. There's another question about kind of behavior change and hygiene behavior change, which targets specifically targeting vulnerable households rather than hardware. Were there examples of interventions where there was perhaps different behavior change messages going to different parts dependent on who was in a community?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually, again, going back to the SNV study, that was one of the strategies, if you like, that SNV employed across a few countries, was tailored behaviour change processes addressed at different groups based on understanding, their different situations and their needs and their barriers. And there's an example from Nepal where they realized that in the more Muslim areas of the community that they weren't getting traction, and they didn't know why, and they changed approach and they shifted to having a Muslim facilitator and to getting the households within that community who had already built a toilet, having them be the ones to advocate to those who didn't. And so they changed strategies to try and focus on those particular groups, those particular barriers, and tailor the approach. So I think that is a really important part of support mechanisms, is thinking about behaviour change. So I'm really glad whoever raised that question. It's a really important one. And as Jeremy said, lots of the literature is very focused around financial mechanisms. And I think these questions of how we engage with more subtle aspects of behaviour change and software mechanisms in thinking about support is a key direction that the sector needs to move in.
Did you find, this was responding to a question which has just come in, did you find any kind of really innovative examples of non-financial support mechanisms that have been proved to work?
I think what we found was the kind of combinations we've described. I don't know that, that word innovative is, it's always hard to meet that bar. It always feels very high.
I suppose
so I think
that was actually my word rather than the question.
Was it? Okay.
I apologise for that. I suppose new, like beyond because the whole point of the Frontiers is that it's looking beyond a traditional CLTS approach. So were there any kind of beyond your traditional CLTS approach non-financial mechanisms that you found?
I think the linking with businesses in different forms and partnerships with business is beyond typical CLTS approaches, and it doesn't necessarily have to just be about financial mechanisms like rebates and discounts, but it can be about working with those groups to, again, kind of similarly to government officials, to sensitize them to the needs of reaching, to try and reach all, and that they, either in their products or in the way they sort their own finances, may cross-subsidize to make sure that they're reaching particular groups. So I guess that's one that's at least a step outside of typical intra-community support that might normally be looked at in CLTS.
And where have you seen that to be effective?
Hang on. So Jeremy was about to jump in. I'll just let him jump in so I can think of a response on that.
Sorry, Jamie. Yeah, I didn't want to derail too much, but I just wanted to make a point that it may not always be about novelty or innovation as well. I mean, we may already have many of the sort of tools and approaches that we need, and it's just a matter of applying them more systematically and applying them sustainably, or sustaining the application of them over a longer period of time, and just adapting and monitoring and tweaking the approaches rather than inventing something that's really new that we haven't seen before. It might be just part of the solution might be practicing fundamentals a bit better and just doing it more systematically.
Okay, I've now come up with my answer to your question about examples of inclusive business models. So there is, in the worker, it's actually a worker plan in Eastern Indonesia. I guess they took an inclusive approach to supporting development of sanitation enterprises, and including getting more women involved in running those enterprises. And one of the things we found through a separate piece of research was about that a lot of these women had quite a high level of sense of social responsibility. And there's one in NTT who not only was wanting to make sure that she sold products at affordable prices to be able to reach all, but she started looking at how she could employ in her business some of these different groups, and including people with a disability. So I think that's a great example of how the whole thing can be turned on its head. And then we had, disadvantaged groups actually getting an economic benefit from being involved in the sanitation sector rather than just being a recipient at the end of the line.
Great, thanks for that. So we've had another comment from Louise about the initiative in the Philippines and elite capture, and saying they've used community rewards, and initially the funds were provided by UNICEF, but since then this has been taken on by the governments in some of the regions. It would be interesting to hear more about that change at some point. And it is usually a cash reward with amounts varying in different parts of the country, which should then be used by the community in WASH plans. But she also knows that it's difficult to be certain that there is no elite capture, but the community council has to approve the WASH plans. So there is some level of community participation and oversight on behalf of a community group. So thank you for that, Louise. I'm just scrolling through to see if there's any questions I've missed. If you do think I've missed your question, please do type it in again. There's been
unfortunately, only Jamie can see the question.
I have struggled a bit ensuring all is.
Yeah, it'd be good if we can
raised.
The presenters can see them too. So we're basically, Jeremy and I are sitting on the other side of the world to Jamie, and we only hear the question when he poses it. We can't see anything in writing, unfortunately.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No, that's okay.
I think we've covered most things. Do either of you have any? What are your key takeaways from this whole process? What would you like everyone in this room now to go away having learnt, or not learnt, but reinforced?
Yeah, I'd say the combinations message of that we should be looking at combinations of support, that we need to, if we're going to develop an evidence base in the sector on this issue, we really need to think about it early in how we design things. And it's a very tricky thing, because if you're trying to evolve and adapt mechanisms on the run, it can be hard to actually know what you've implemented when you get to the other end, when you try and assess what changes took place. So I think there has to be a lot of really careful thought in design about how we monitor and evaluate, so that we can create a strengthened evidence base. I mean, for me, that was the strongest finding really in developing this issue, was just how we don't know what works best where, and that we need to make more effort to find out.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that the importance of institutionalizing the support mechanisms into local government processes, which I think we can agree is needed in the long term for sustainable outcomes, so that we're continuing to shift from a project focus to a delivery focus, in which the government is the duty bearer for ensuring that everyone is having access to safe sanitation. And it can be a difficult process, as people have pointed out, that government capacity can be quite low, but as we stated before, I think every intervention and every program is an opportunity to incrementally improve government capacity until they're able to take over things on their own and expand it.
Great. So we've had a couple more come in, if you don't mind. We have, I think, a few minutes left. One is about toilet technology transfers to local communities, and if there are any examples of that.
So that's about teaching people in the community, particularly new technologies. Is that your reading of that?
Or finding cheap technologies which then can be rolled out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a typical activity of many development partners and NGOs, is developing low-cost models and then looking at how to support enterprises to replicate and to sell those products. So yeah, I mean, I think there are many examples across the world of that. And then obviously there are, you know, some of the internationally sold products like the SATO plan, etc., of low cost supplies that can be bought across countries, but more typically it's about the local production at lower costs that I've seen.
Great. And then we have a comment/question again from Louise, UNICEF Philippines, who mentions operating in fragile areas, which it wasn't part of the case study which was presented, but it is ongoing now in other parts of the Philippines, where access to interact with the population directly and to even monitor is a major challenge, even for government officials in some areas. And as similar to the points raised by Juliet, the approach that's being used is to bring together local leaders, religious leaders, local organizations together to be able to access these locations and to advocate and build their capacity for sanitation promotion and monitoring, as well as bringing community members for latrine construction training and bulk provision of some latrine construction materials that are meant to be used for most in need households. However, it is difficult verifying the results and reports, and they're looking at ways that this can be strengthened. But I think, yeah, so I suppose it's a question of how it's going back to how can you operate in areas where you can't get your staff to, I suppose, and looking at local institutions that may be able to facilitate that. But that adds another degree, another dimension to the challenge, I suppose.
Yeah, we agree. I think this is like more of an issue of just development in conflict zones and fragile areas, in which the CLTS Knowledge Hub did have an issue a few years back. I think that Frank Reeves authored. I think, yeah, working in conflict zones and kind of disaster situations, oftentimes levels of access are so low across all areas or multiple areas that it can be difficult to see, I mean, to sort of disaggregate who is really disadvantaged, because everyone's struggling, and it's almost a whole other set of problems just to get any kind of a foundational mechanisms or processes in place in which anyone can take advantage to improve their sanitation access, let alone people that are disadvantaged. I don't want to say that you would not focus on it, have a quality focus, or want to focus on disadvantaged groups in a conflict situation. But it's definitely much more challenging. I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
And then there's one, this is going to be the final question, unfortunately, about what are the cost advantages of doing an approach like this versus where you have to gather lots of information, which is expensive, and then provide the program, which may also be expensive and challenging and complex, to delivering a more simplified approach with broader subsidies and rebates for a wider section of the population?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, and I think yeah, there's just trade-offs on all sides. Yeah, so you do something more detailed and more costly to try and narrow who's targeted, versus yeah, having a broader set of people who access a mechanism, but perhaps some of them didn't actually need it, but because it was easier to administer, it's a lower cost. So I think that's got to be weighed up situation by situation, and to understand the kind of the depth of inequality in a given context. Because yeah, I think with more extreme inequalities, maybe there's going to be more reasons why you need more specific and targeted approaches. And particularly if we're thinking about the multiple forms of disadvantage and not just financial disadvantage. I think it's easier to do things broad brush if we're only focused on affordability, But if we're talking about other barriers, then I think it is hard to get away from a more detailed approach to addressing each of the different forms of disadvantage and barriers they face.
Great. Well, I'd like to end by thanking the two presenters and thanking everyone for participating in this session. If you do have any more burning questions later, please do send them in. Do keep in touch, and we will work out ways. If lots of these questions are still unanswerable and we're still grappling with them, but we can work out ways of seeing if they're answerable or not, and if not, working out ways of how we may go about answering them. Again, this Frontiers will be released next week. If you would like, and will be on the website and sent to you, if you would like hard copies of either part 1 or part 2 or any of our Frontiers series, do get in touch and we can work out a way to get them sent out to you. Any final words, Juliet and Jeremy, before I close?
No, just thank you everyone for hanging in there. There's still a lot of participants out there,
Yeah.
and that's fantastic. I think it shows us that we haven't cracked this one. It's very awkward sitting here to try and answer questions that I think all of us need to be discussing collectively. So I just hope that we continue to keep this topic alive in forums where we can all interact with one another, not just in a one-two-way webinar situation. So look forward to more conversations with all of you on this and to progressing together.
And we'll think about some more opportunities where we're able to have these conversations face to face and in a nicer environment, perhaps, for participation.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I hope everyone has a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.